guys ready? Okay. Good morning. Today we're having a workshop, and the chairman's asked me to, since it sort of falls under audit, finance, all the boards involved though, but we're having a budget workshop in terms of setting priorities for specifically CIP, but also I'm sure we'll get into some discussion about the operational budget. We've passed financial parameters, which we'll revisit this morning. We just passed them at the budget workshop. Oh, you are here. We didn't know you were coming. And we're expecting Lex and the chairman shortly. So, but they've both said go ahead and get started. So I'm going to turn it over to Art, and Art, you can introduce it.
Okay, and thank you. As in the past, we're going to have Phil Brenner, our Director of OMB, do the presentation, and the presentation is up. And if Phil, are you ready?
I am ready.
Let's get started then.
Good morning, everyone. Today, as Mayor Siegel said, we're here to talk about the fiscal 17 budget, and what we have in the first slide is just a quick shot of the agenda. We're going to revisit the financial parameters. We're going to talk about the cash flow, and then we're going to look at the 2017 budget priority considerations. So with that, I'd like to begin with the parameters. And these are the budget parameters that you approved at the June 23rd board meeting. I would like to just point out 4 items on this that were guiding principles when we developed the cash flow in our funding envelopes. First was the assumption on sales tax, where we were taking a 1%, 1%, 0.75%, 0.5%, and 0.25% reduction or haircut from the Bill Gilmer numbers. At the bottom of the page, we want to make sure that we are financially sustainable, and the baseline of operating expenses will grow no more than 1.5% annually, and future capital expenditures that become operating need to be supported by sustainable revenue sources.
When we say baseline here, we mean operating the current system, not additional service.
That's correct. It basically means what we will be operating in August. Again, any service improvements or changes to that would be, we'd have to look at them on a cost-benefit analysis, and when you're presented with any type of service changes, we'll make sure that you see the costs and the manpower involved in implementing that. And then also, the last parameter that I wanted to just highlight was the board's directive to include an additional $10 million as a reserve. So I'll show you this later in the presentation, but as far as the reserves go, we will have 15% of operating expenses as required by debt policy, and then emergency reserves consisting of 10% of operating expenses and $10 million as directed by board policy. This next slide, again, is talking about our order of allocation of our revenue. And I put this back up here to highlight the fact that the 4th item down, the reserves that we are going to carry, yes, the 4th item will also contain the additional $10 million. And because the board has given us that directive as policy, we've moved it up in priority from where it was when we presented it at the first mid-year forecast meeting. The next slide, which is blown up in your handouts so you can follow along, is basically the full cash flow update. And I wanted just to talk in general about how the cash flow was put together, how we worked the parameters into it, and then this is the resulting factor.
Phil, can I just jump in for a second?
Of course.
If you have bad eyesight like I do, you can go, it's also in the big handout.
Yes.
Not that I'm saying none of you have bad eyesight and you're old like I am, but go ahead, Phil.
Okay, thank you. Again, we've worked through all of the parameters so that this cash flow represents the 1.5% growth on base operating expenses. It represents $10 million of additional reserves in there, and the other aspects of the parameters. That the guidance on the order of allocation was worked in also, highlighting the $10 million as in at the very bottom on line 74, which are the $10 million additional operating reserves. So from there, what we did was we developed the funding envelopes.
Can I insert something in here real quick?
Of course.
Just line 62, you know, I want, and I know the board understands this, but I want the public to understand this. It's showing a negative net outflow or net flow of funds. And that really is a planned spending down of our reserves.
That's correct. And as we get further in the presentation, there will be a slide where I show you and the public the ending reserves that we have, what our cash balances are, to show that this planned drawdown of reserves, as you said, is planned. So to determine the funding envelopes, we went back to the order of allocation, and we know that, for example, in 2017, we project that there will be $789 million worth of funding sources. That's in line 22. So from there, what we did is we looked at the debt service that we know we will pay. We looked at the sales tax shown in line 7 is net of the general mobility transfer. So what that means is that we've already taken that into consideration. And then we fund the operating budget, which is on line 37. Then what we do is we start looking at the capital budget. And this is where a lot of today's discussion is going to be. And the one assumption that we've made with board guidance is that we will fully fund the Metro Rail expansion. So if there is a need, and there will be a need as we go forward, and I show you the rest of the handouts, to reduce our capital improvement plan from what departments and what everyone has requested, we know that it will be in that CIP.
Before we move on, this is fairly involved. Does anyone have any questions about the cash flow? Just understanding the format? Okay.
Now, this next slide, the cash flow update, which is also blown up in your handouts, basically gives you just some key information out of the cash flow, which will shape the discussion that we're going to have later. And one thing that's interesting is A, shows you the sales tax haircut that we're taking. B, shows us the net sales tax that is available for Metro's use after that GMP transfer. And then in C, this is where we start talking about the capital budget. And the total envelope, funding envelope for the capital budget is that capital improvement program line. But what we've done is we've subdivided the envelope into what is currently contracted and obligated and then what is not obligated. And as we get further in our discussion, I'll be able to define for you exactly what obligated means. But the quick version is if something is under contract, or if we've made an external commitment to an outside entity to undertake that project. Then the last piece of this talks about the ending cash balance. And this is designed to show you board members and the public that those planned drawdowns that Mayor Siegel talked about are included in all of this, and at the end of the day, there's money in the bank. And that money in the bank, the total number, is that ending cash balance. But within that ending cash balance, you'll see the breakout of the 15% reserve on the debt, the 10% per board policy, and also the additional $10 million. So what that shows you is that we've adequately made sure that we're covering everything that the board and our debt policy allows us to have. Then in that bottom line in E, that is your ending cash net of those reserves. And one thing that I'd like to point out in that ending cash is that if you look at 2020, that's our crunch year. So what I wanted to emphasize is that even though there might be ending cash net of reserves available in the years prior to 2020, it's that 5-year plan that we've put together that allows us to solve for the tough year. So in other words, that ending cash net of reserves, we're looking to maintain that in the bank to get us through so that everything works fine in 2020.
So to really underline all of this, what we're saying here is that we have taken a conservative assumption on sales tax. We've assumed less sales tax than our economist has told us. We have done a conservative requirement on reserves. We've included reserves that we are not contractually obligated to carry as reserves. And we have projected ahead 5 years, and it all adds up. So in other words, you can look at this and say that 2020 ending cash net of reserves, that's a small number, that's scary. I look at this as saying we've done a bunch of conservative assumptions, and we can show that we can maintain all of our current service, build all of the projects we have committed to build, not do a fare increase, and the budget still adds up, which means that fundamentally, as long as we don't get crazy about spending our money, this is a sign that we're in good financial shape.
And I would just add to that, Christoph, is that in year 2020, if you look at that, we have, actually at this point in time, our non-obligated CIP dollars have gone up. So depending upon what we do in the upcoming years before that, if there was even a bigger crunch, we could reduce it and we're still financially stable.
Yeah.
Mr. Brenner, the available sales tax, how recent is that estimate from Dr. Gilmer? Is it something he has updated since the fall in oil prices, or is it something that he had done prior to that?
It's a recent update and provided to Metro in June.
And I completely agree with what Christoph said. I would add to that, and I think it's a real compliment to the stewardship of Mayor Siegel and the staff that has been very, very judicious and careful in making sure we don't overextend ourselves. I would note, and I had a chance to go over these numbers with Mayor Siegel last week too, I would note we don't have a lot of extra cash lying around, and we don't. We are, because of the stewardship of Cindy with the help of the staff and other board members, we are in good shape for an agency whose primary source of revenue is declining right now because of the economy. But as we're approached by people wanting additional services and wanting additional capital investments, you know, we really right now don't have the money for much of that. So I just want to alert the public that we are surviving well given the financial stewardship, but we're taking a hit like everyone else, and requests for additional service and or additional projects right now, to the extent we have to match a federal grant, for example, or that sort of thing. We've got to wait out this economy before we're going to be able to do everything we'd like to do.
And to sort of hammer that home, if we're talking about additional bus service, which is $250,000 a year over 4 years, that wipes out that $602,000 right there.
Right.
Yeah, it does not take very much in operating costs. It does not take very much in capital costs to change this picture very much.
Correct. And further to that, I still think personally some of that has to be done, but we just need to go in with eyes open, knowing that we don't have the kind of money we would have in a better economy.
And we have to find where that money comes
And
from.
we have
that
to
may
find
have to
where it
come
comes
from
from.
somewhere else.
Yes.
But we have to find where it comes from.
Right. Again, many congratulations to Cindy and those who have been on her team for getting us in this shape and keeping us in this shape. It's really important, and we thank you very much.
Well,
because
really it's staff and Tom's leadership, I think, is
Tom and Debbie
only
and
one part of the team. I
Art
appreciate
and
it,
Philip.
Madam Chair.
Well, no, I really do want to recognize staff. That is who drives it, along with the mayor, and really, really appreciate it because it has been otherwise in the past, and really appreciate it.
So, Sanjay?
Well, I agree. This is to make sure things work out in 2020 and that we don't have a whole lot of, wiggle room for additional projects, additional services, so on and so forth. I want to make sure folks watching this or looking at this recognize that there is that $70 million by board policy, the additional 10% in operating reserves and the $10 million in additional reserve, that is there for any other unforeseen things that may come up.
It's like an emergency. If we have, heaven forbid, a bomb drop on this building or whatever. You know, I think we've got insurance, but it's also for those situations where sometimes, and, you know, Bel Air saw this during one of the many hurricanes I was mayor through. But, you know, the city had to come up with the funds short term before we started being reimbursed from FEMA and our insurance agency. And that's where I think sometimes if you got to keep those situations in mind. Or there may be, you know, if there was some federal mandate that came down, then we would be in a position that we'd have funds to draw on.
The only reason I was mentioning it is I just don't want somebody to interpret this to say we are within $600,000 off not having any cash on hand.
No.
Right. No, that's a really excellent point. We have, you know, how much is it in reserves?
The 10%, 15% for the debt policy and 10% for the, quote, emergency, and then the additional $10 million that we added on top of it. So you'll see that the line above the the bottom line is the reserves, but the reserves after we've met our parameters, right?
So if you look at 2020, you'll see that there's $162 million of cash that we'll have in the bank. And and $70 million of that will be for emergencies. So we'll have that in the bank, assuming everything goes exactly as this forecast says. But that's what you have, and that's what you put together in terms of having enough funds on hand in case there is some sort of emergency.
I think, well, I'd appreciate hearing, or at least somebody acknowledging that, yes, we're fiscally conservative and we're planning for any potential contingency needs, but we don't, in the next, at least in the near term, we don't see any other federal funds that we can bank on coming in. So this is really what we have, and anything that we add means that we're taking from somewhere else. There's no piggy bank that I am aware of that we can bank on in the next few years that we're aware of.
I think the way to look at it, and I'm going to wear my accountant hat here, but the thing for people to take away from this is the agency's not broke. We're not in any way broke. If you're sitting there with this year, $146 million in cash, you know, that's not a broke agency. You know, if you look at 2017, if I did my math right, we have, after our sales tax, we have a net operating revenue of $112 million before we pay for CIP. That's
Right.
after we do our operational and our debt service. So, you know, when I look at it, it's no different than personally. It's like we've saved money for, in year 2, I'm going to have to replace the roof on my house, or I've got a problem with my foundation, or whatever it is. That's what the CIP is there for. That's for things that have value beyond just the immediate year. Not that the operations doesn't, but something that adds value to the network or the system as a whole. So this is a really, I think, conservative, well thought out plan. What we have to do today is determine the priorities in terms of, with our non-obligated capital, which Phil and Art will go over, where we want to spend those dollars, planning for the next 5 years. So if we enter into something that would go out for 3 years or 4 years, 5 years, that's going to be coming out of, you know, all that blue line for future years. So we'd have to subtract that. And what we need to do today is sort of give direction to staff. But we do have a plan here that provides for the financial stability of the agency. I don't think we would have as high bond rating if we didn't have that in place, and this just ensures that we continue to be good stewards of the tax dollars while still meeting the mission of this agency.
And I'll also add, as somebody who follows what happens in a lot of other cities, most transit agencies' contingency plan for sales tax comes in below projections is we will cut bus service. That's sort of what most agencies are carrying as their contingency. So the fact that we have built that in as saying we are not going to cut any service, I think is a really important move, and I feel really good about that.
Okay. Go ahead.
Well, Mayor Siegel, your comments just before are a perfect lead into the next slide. This is not blown up in your package, but it's meant to be a graphical representation to talk about the choices that we're going to ask your guidance on. And basically, what this shows in every year throughout the plan, in the green, it's the capital improvement plan, excluding Metro Rail expansion, and the piece of it that is obligated in green, and the part that's not obligated is in light blue. So as you can see, as we go out in the years of the plan, there is less and less that is obligated, and that's where we're looking for your guidance in how to prioritize those items.
But what we do now will change this going forward. If we say we want to spend X dollars for the next 3 years on bus shelters or a state of good repair, that's going to come out, and we're going to see the future slides, the future years change.
That's correct.
Move from blue to green.
And what we can do is, as we go through the years, as projects change from blue to green, we'll be able to update the list of individual projects with that so that we'll always be able to give you a good split as to what's obligated and what's not.
And the only other thing I would add is that if things turn around, means there'll be more money that we can reallocate or direct in some other capacity. And also if things get tight, as long as we, I think, have some sort of non-obligated capital for the future, then there's always sort of, in addition to the reserves that we've set in our parameters, there's still some wiggle room in there.
No, and I would add on top of that, and something we're looking at in the capital committee, and I know something Karin cares about a lot, one of the best things you can do while things are tight is actually plan future capital projects. That we should always have a list of good capital projects that we have defined and quantified the benefits of and quantified the cost of that exceeds our ability to do those projects. Because then, if the world is better than we think it is, we have plans that are ready to go. Then if federal grants become available, we have plans that are ready to go. So one of the things we should be doing is making sure that we have lots of good projects in the pipeline.
The next slide, again, is just a restatement of the ending reserves. We've talked a lot about that. Of course, the point of this is to show that we have money in the bank, and this is a solid financial plan.
And in year 2020, we will, in fact, if this goes exactly as planned, have $162,997,000 in the bank.
That's correct. So I'd like to start now talking about 2017 and our priority considerations. And Mr. Lambert, if you would like to.
Well, Mr. Smiley and Mr. Brenner have assured me that all those numbers will be good in the out year, so I'll take their credit. Madam Chair, what we want to do is make sure from a staff perspective, put on the table for discussion by the board what we think some of the priority considerations need to be in a time when we are fiscally challenged, but it's, Mr. Spieler said, it is an opportunity now to reshape for the future. So you see, that's something we think we need to be planning for. First and foremost, making sure that the system that the board has invested in to improve the quality of transit service, both in bus, rail, Metrolift, HOV hot lanes, Metro Star Van, all of our services, we make sure we have a good state of good repair. Taking care of the system we've got now to maintain it today so we don't get it where it doesn't maintain the quality standards we're looking for in the future. So we believe that's extremely important as the board considers your priorities going to the future. We built.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
That would come out of non-obligated, right?
That would come
That's
out
not, what's in our contracted and obligated is things that we have, in fact, not a board priority, but it's something that we have contractually committed to.
That's correct. This is not currently
MOU or
identified
legal.
in the capital budget, so
Okay.
we would want the board to consider this going forward.
Or
And
presumably some of it is identified in that there are some state of good repair projects that are ongoing right
that are
now.
under contract and obligated.
Right.
Yes, but most of it isn't.
That is correct. The second issue is, and again, we listened a lot to the board retreat, and I think the board made it very clear. The first and most important aspect is making sure the current system today has great experience on our customers. So making sure we focus on maintaining the system we've got now, but further improving that system. And some of those things we believe can be done without a lot of capital investment, with a lot of more operating investment, is how we do things better. Continue to work on that. So we'd want to make sure that that's considered. Making sure that our customer experience is one that it's ease of access to transit, it's universal access to transit, it's all the things we've heard the board talk about. Making sure that we've got infrastructure improvements where people can get to transit easily, making sure that their experience when using transit is comfortable. So the discussions of more shelters, more amenities that make that ridership experience better is something we would like the board to consider in your considerations. Again, building upon the foundation today that leads us to the opportunity to continue to improve going forward. And then last, but clearly not least, is how are we planning for the future? There are things that we can do today, And I think we heard the board say this. We need to celebrate the good things we've done. We need to market the things we've done. We need to let people know about the opportunities of travel choices that they can make by using Metro services in the region, working with all of our regional partners to improve the system we have today that then sets the parameters where the chair and the board can then collaborate with all of our regional partners to what should that next plan be. So we've got to make sure, and we would hope the board would consider part of your priority consideration is making sure that there are appropriate funding levels available to help us prepare for that next plan when we're ready to implement. So, Madam Chair, that's kind of the perspective from the staff standpoint. We look forward to the board's guidance in setting priorities and policies that the staff will implement, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
One thing I think isn't it in our big, if you look towards the big packet at the back, I think just in terms of, so everyone knows and our new board members, this is what's in the CIP plan. This is contractual, obligated, and then it's discretionary. The blue is the discretionary. So this is more detail, but in talking with staff and the chairman sort of planning today, I thought Tom's given management's input in terms of priorities there. And if we can maybe first focus on CIP and then we can wrap it up with, based upon our discussions of CIP, there may be impacts that also in terms of priority direct staff related to operational budget. So I thought we could do it just like the chairman ran the retreat. We've got the pads of paper up here. We could just go around the room or jump in and talk about what your top 3 or 4 priorities is.
One request I would have separate from this meeting, given the amount of data we have and don't have, is that we really do a workshop as part of our regional transit plan, as part of our capital planning, that looks at the expansion projects that are in here and quantifies them in terms of benefits and costs, both on the operating and the capital side. I feel like looking at some of these projects and debating their merits of, which park and ride is worth expanding compared to which local transit center needs help compared to where can we do a light rail extension, I feel like the amount of information we have in front of us here is not really a good amount of information to be able to judge the relative merits of projects. And I think that's worthy of a separate workshop.
Is that something that capital improvement
I
committee can
think
do
that's
with
the relevant committee, yes.
Yeah. I mean, because I would think it's going to entail more than just one meeting.
Agreed. And the nice thing is a lot of that is not this year's budget. A lot of that is one fiscal year
It's
out.
kind of going through and revetting things.
So it is not necessarily an urgency of we have to do this as part of the budget adoption cycle, but it is something that I think a really important discussion for us to have. Because there are assumptions about which projects are worth doing and which aren't. And as a board, I think we really need to go through that in detail.
So my suggestion would be we determine sort of our overall CIP priorities, safety, good state of good repair, whatever. And then based upon board consensus on that, then the CIP committee then would need to drill down to see how each of those projects supports what our overall board priorities are. Is everyone in agreement? That seems like a good process. Tom, you're okay with that too? Okay. So does anyone want to go first, or do we want to just start?
I have a specific
Christoph,
question here that I'd like more explanation on. The Metro Rail expansion, which we've talked about as committed, most of that is committed in the sense that we have made commitments to the FTA rather than that we have made contractual commitments. And I'd like more detail on sort of what commitments we've made and what the triggers on those commitments are. In other words, we've told the FTA we'll buy more vehicles. What have we told the FTA in terms of what triggers that requirement to buy more vehicles?
Do we have feedback on that? Art, Tom?
The phase 2 commitments, which is the vehicles, that was part of the original full funding grant agreement. It was just timing. The actual commitment is a headway, a 2030 headway. That's the commitment that we've given to the FTA.
So, but you said that's in 2030?
Yes, the headway commitment is in 2030, And the way the FFGA was structured, the plan was that we needed these additional vehicles, we needed the maintenance away facility, and we needed additional track expansion to meet that commitment.
Because what I'm looking at here is on the Metro Rail expansion total, we're looking at between 10 and 60 million a year. I realize the 60 million number includes a good deal of projects that are underway. We need to finish building things. But I think I would really be interested in seeing a breakdown here of which of these is money that is either already contractually obligated to a builder, for example, or is necessary to maintain current service levels, and which of this is necessary to increase capacity or increase service levels.
Mr.
And
Phillip.
then for the latter, a good understanding of if the only commitment we've made to the FTA is 2030, then maybe we don't need to think of all of these as must-dos in this period.
I think that's part of the analysis we're doing now on how many more vehicles do we need to have to meet service demand, and we expect to have some briefings to the board next month on that.
I mean, the reason I say that is I don't want to be reserving a lot of money in this budget for things we don't really have to do
Well, and
within this time period.
And that was a discussion, what is obligated, what's contractually obligated. We've got MOUs, we've got contractual obligations, a contract with stuff that's already being built out, like the bridge, for example. But staff pointed out in a meeting that I had with them that, if we said we want to spend more than what is just shown up, I mean, there is the ability in some cases to come in and get out of a contract. You may have to pay a penalty for it. So that's something that I think they're going to have to drill down deeper.
No, and what concern it is, my understanding here is of the Metro Rail expansion, a large portion of that commitment is commitment to the FTA, not a signed contract to build something. And I think it's really important that we as a board understand what those commitments are. And it also ties into something you've asked for a long time, which is sort of a closeout financial analysis of these projects, which I think those two go very much hand in hand. How much money do we have to spend to finish the work compared to what commitments have we made in the future?
And that's something that we're sort of working on. I think that we could move forward. Sort of one of my goals for next year.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say about that is we need to make sure that when we do this analysis, that we're also communicating to the FTA. So we've got a plan we put before the FTA and said, basically, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're committed to. If we're going to change that, we need to let them know. You agree?
And at this point, I'm not advocating.
I think yours went on.
Advocating
Looking
us
at some
getting the
alternative.
information to understand what the plan is and to understand what the constraints around that plan are.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll go first. I mean, state of good repair is a priority for me, and I think the reason behind it is sort of what the chief said. We don't want to be shortchanging the agency on the current service we have, and then when 2020 comes around, by not having invested the money in these next years, then be in a situation where we're even instead of I'm going to make up a number, a $50 million, maybe we have a $300 million problem. We see the federal government, we see a lot of groups kick it down the road, but I don't think we want to do that. Improve, enhance current service, the current system, I'd say, shelters, access to the new bus network, obviously safety, and that's sort of good, state of good repair, but safety is always an issue, both for our employees as well as our customers. And then I would say technology as it relates to enhancing what we've got, but I think we have to be prudent and smart about it, enhancing what we're providing, the service for the customer, or in terms of our employees, giving them the tools to make them allow them to do things smarter, faster, with basically less overhead. So those are mine. You want to go, Madam Chair?
Well, let's see. I have so many priorities, and we don't have the money to do most of them right now. Let me take a pass and listen
Okay.
first. Yeah.
So, yeah, I had a question. Where does compliance fall on this list? Because I'm concerned about ADA compliance of our bus stops.
Well, I think that should be high on the list. And in fact, I do want to wait till everybody else has talked because it will help my brain get in gear on the priorities that I have. But that's just bus stops and bus shelters, to me, are a huge priority. And they need to be ADA compliant, and working with the city to ensure that any improvements being done by the city incorporate that standard, as well as the standard of flexibility for future forms of transit in the corridor, is also a huge goal.
And can I just add, it's all cities and the county. It's all of our partners.
Correct. All of our partners. Very good.
So to me, compliance fits right under the top priority. To me, it's part of state of good repair. Right? If we are not maintaining multiple parts of our system to be compliant, then obviously it's not in state of good repair. That's at least the way I look at it.
That's a very good point. State of good repair, though, is a bit of a term of art, so it probably deserves its own separate emphasis.
And that was one of the things I made, my comment about safety. It's safety for our customers. Both those the people who have handicaps and the people who don't that use it, as well as our employees.
No, and I would underline, I think the phrase improve the customer experience sounds kind of fuzzy, which is what I consider all of this to be part of. I don't think it's fuzzy at all. I think this is the very basic of what we do. Make riding the bus a non-miserable experience would be another way to put that. Because right now it is a miserable experience across big pieces of this region. Some of that is within our control, some of it isn't. Some of that is the reason why we've posted this urban designer position, because that's an opportunity to work with others to improve the part of the experience that we don't control. But to me, there's nothing optional. There's nothing warm and fuzzy about the improve the customer experience. This is the very basics of what we do.
Well, let me just make one comment, because I agree with everything you've said, except I don't think it's a miserable experience for most people. We have huge ridership. There are many ways to improve it, but I just would hate that soundbite to get out there.
And I will say, though, there are definitely parts of the system where it is. And I've been to many of those parts of the system, and I emphasize it in that way just to point out the fact that this isn't about niceties. A lot of this is about basics.
And I think it's the access is really, once you get on the bus, it's
that,
great.
That
but it's
is,
the sidewalks that are ADA compatible. It's having a bench if you're waiting. It's having a shelter in the heat or the rain.
Is that where you're going with
no,
that?
I mean, a really good.
I'm surprised to hear you say that as a frequent rider.
Yeah. A really good example. There was a great transit camp yesterday that was at the Houston Omni Hotel. Thanks to the new bus network, I had half-hourly service over there. I had a really fast, nice bus ride over there. I get off at a bus stop that doesn't have a shelter, cross a street at a crosswalk that's not particularly a safe crosswalk, and then find that the road leading to the hotel has no sidewalk at all. And then once the sidewalk finally picks up, it is in such rough shape that nobody in a wheelchair would ever be able to negotiate it. If I were in a wheelchair, I would have literally had to go down the traffic lanes to get to that hotel. That experience was utterly great until the moment the bus stopped and opened its door. And from there on in, the final couple hundred feet over to the hotel were not a great experience at all.
Well, and that's all further to your point that everybody who does a project in our service area should have to be mindful of how they're going to facilitate transit.
And a lot of that street is a privately owned street. Mm-hmm. Some of that is the hotel's fault, not a public agency's fault. But if you're a rider, that is not a comforting statement. Like, we can't say to the rider, I'm sorry, that wasn't our fault, because at the end of the day, they were trying to get somewhere. And it was not a great experience for them.
Okay.
So who else wants to jump in?
Well, for me, when I read these, and just for me, they all sound like competing great interests, but they sound so general that I'm just curious, how do we get from these? Because to me, they all are high priorities, but they're so high in the sky. How do we nail down to say what exactly does that maintain a state of good repair look like in terms of actual quantifiable initiatives?
Well, this is my thought on it. Is that as a board, we set the priorities and then we have staff implement those priorities. So what I hope, and I think the chairman would concur and Tom would concur, that today those sort of general priorities come out. Because if we came out today and everyone says, we want to expand the service, or we want to add commuter rail or whatever, all of a sudden that changes, upsets the fruit cart, so to speak. But then it's up to staff to create that budget through like CIP's committee's input, but to come back then as part of the 2017 budget to say, based upon your overall priorities, general priorities, we're going to spend $30 million on things that fall within state of good repair. And then at that point, we can say, nitpick, we really want to spend another $5 million on bus shelters or whatever. I mean, Tom, do you concur with that?
Yes, ma'am. I think that's exactly what we're looking for.
We set the priorities and then the specifics on how to implement that.
Could I suggest on top of that this is a case where metrics are incredibly useful? Like, for example, let's say a metric is what percentage of our boardings are at bus stops that are ADA accessible. A metric is what percentage of our boardings are at bus stops that have shelters. And that way, we can look at a proposed budget and we can hear this takes that percentage from X percent to Y percent. And we can actually understand how putting $10 million extra into this program will actually have that effect for our riders. So I would suggest also as guidance to the staff, I would really appreciate seeing some metrics, some goals in terms of quantifying the customer experience. And I would say some of those are less budgetary. Like, to me, our goal ought to be 100% of the information that customers get is correct information, which is a goal we're not meeting today, but a goal I would very much like to see us adopt in terms of how we think about things, how we operate things internally. So I think thinking about these metrics that turn that phrase customer experience into something measurable, I think would be a very useful move.
And adding to that, I'd like to see us go for a low-hanging fruit. We may be able to meet some of these by knocking out the things that are not that costly.
Yeah.
Or partnering with the city of Houston or Harris County or
exactly.
the small cities. If they're putting in a street, then we put in the bench if they do the sidewalk and we do the shelter. I mean, I think that that's sort of the drill down. But the first step, I believe, is us setting what our overall priorities are.
Cindy, my number one priority actually falls into both improving current service and improving the customer experience. And that would be to, as quickly as we can, implement a mobile ticketing system that would let a cash-paying customer be able to clearly transfer anywhere on the system. I'm convinced that there are a lot of people that pay cash that simply don't understand how to do that. And even though we're supposed to be giving the cash-paying customer on the bus a Q card, I don't think that's happening in every case. And I truly believe that we could really improve the ridership experience for those people if we move to some kind of an opening or an open ticketing thing. The other priorities, I've got 5 things that all would fit within improving current service and improving customer experience. My number 2 would be expanding our shelters and making them ADA compliant. To me, it would be terribly miserable to stand in the mud and in the rain to catch a bus. My number 3 would be to expand park and ride in the growing northwest part of Harris County. If that were an incorporated city, that would be the 5th largest city in America. Yet we have very little service out there, and with the exception of Tomball, all of that is in the sales tax area, and those people are paying to support Metro. My 4th would be filling in gaps in the new bus network. I think we did a very positive thing with our Manchester expansion, and I would like for us to continue to look at that and focus on areas that lost service that really need their own dedicated routes. That would be a critically important thing. And then my 5th would be, this is something I've had lots of conversations with Chief Lambert about, but looking to expand MetroLift out further into the taxpaying area with a demand response type service. And I think that's something that TTI is studying for us right now.
Okay.
Hey, Jim, just going back to what you were just saying and coupled with what I initially said, all great, clear objectives. I'm just curious then, where do you see those fitting? Do you see what I'm saying? Because they're
Well,
very clear.
I think they really fit into both improving current service and improving the customer experience. Clearly, a really solid ticketing system and shelter expansion would do both of those things, as would filling in gaps in the new bus network.
I will say, and with regards to those, the riders I talk to and see on the buses, I don't think ticketing is close to our biggest issue. I do think, I'm totally with Lex on this. I think the experience at the bus stop is by far the biggest problem with our current system. And I think in second place, which is really important in that improved current service line, is travel time and reliability. To me, if I look at the core of our system, those high ridership routes that carry by far the most people, you look at Westheimer, you look at Richmond, you look at Gessner, you look at Scott, you look at those routes that are really the backbone of our ridership, where one of those routes might carry as much as an entire freeway worth of park and ride ridership. A lot of those routes are significantly affected by congestion, which means we have severe reliability problems, which to me is more than travel time. Reliability really matters, because reliability means, will I be late to work today or not? You can't predict it. So I think a real focus in terms of improving current service on the reliability of local bus service, and I think doing it in a smart way, looking at what are little improvements we can make, things like traffic signal priority for late running buses, those kind of things that can make significant improvements in reliability. I think that's a huge one. And the second is travel time, because one thing that we did not achieve with the new bus network in most of these corridors are significant improvements in speed over long distances. And I think the Westheimer bus is a really good example of that. It hits major employment centers at West Chase, at Uptown, and downtown. I think we really should be looking at how do we make the travel time between those major employment centers faster? How do we get somebody from the west side to downtown faster? How do we get somebody from downtown to Greenway faster? Because each of those is hubs that gets a lot of service feeding into it. And if you can create sort of fast express connections between those, which there's many ways to do that, but improve the travel time between them, it benefits a huge number of our current riders.
Well, I don't disagree with your notion on that, but to fix Westheimer, somehow the city of Houston is going to have to make the traffic clear where it builds up at 610, because that's what backs Westheimer up. And also to speed it up, in addition to that, you've got to have signal preemption for the buses.
No, and I think signal preemption is an affordable thing we can do, because that is something that, in terms of capital cost, is a relatively low-cost item. I also think that in many cases, this starts taking us to routes which don't follow the same route. I mean, one of the projects in here is actually a signature service on Westheimer. And that might be something that's on outer Westheimer, but actually leaves Westheimer, say uses Richmond, uses the freeway, uses something else to bypass some of the slowest parts of Westheimer. So that if you're on the outer part of that corridor, you can get sort of a faster shortcut service that will get you into the core of the city.
Like the lady who came and wanted a quick line down Westheimer.
Yes, exactly. And,
So-
and I think that's a really good project that benefits a lot of people, especially in helping people get to work quicker.
Well, it could likely run a lot faster on Richmond than Westheimer, but Christoph, I do disagree with you on the ticketing thing. I have a special interest in the East End because I sort of grew up out there, and I still spend a lot of time there, and I have talked to a number of writers, particularly Spanish-speaking people, and they really have a problem with transfers because they don't understand how to do it.
No, and I agree. I mean, where I agree with you on ticketing totally is I think passenger education efforts are huge. I think there are a lot of people who would benefit from using the ticketing technologies we have in place right now, who are not fully using them because they do not understand them or because they have concerns, which are, like, for example, people who assume that every Q card has to be registered, therefore, if you have a Q card, you're being tracked, which is not actually the case. But we haven't done a good job of notifying, of making people aware of that. And I think mobile ticketing is something else that there's a lot of people who would benefit who aren't using it. So I think that the education outreach around ticketing, I think there's still a huge amount of positive work we can do that's not going to show up as a big line item in this budget, but that can help a lot of people.
Madam Chair, I just want to make sure the board knows we are in discussions with the city of Houston on the outer Westheimer now. So there's some things we've already begun to look at, and we'll be coming back to the board with a much more detailed understanding of what we think some steps might be on a pilot program out there as well.
Can I ask a question? And so, like, if we did a quick line that, quote, Westheimer, and if it's only stopping, for example, at the major employment centers, I mean, is it feasible that if you come up on traffic, that it can be diverted to, like, Richmond and then come back over? Like, if I'm driving down the freeway and or driving down the streets of Bel Air and there's backup, whether it saves you time or not, the tendency is to cut over and look for a place that you don't have it backed up. I mean, do we have that ability?
To me, if you don't miss a stop, the answer would be yes, right?
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
you're
we're
not,
taking a look at all options. We're taking a look at stop spacing. We're taking a look at employment centers. And that's, I think we're trying to take a briefing to the July board or July committee as to here are all the options that we are taking a look at, get feedback, and that way we can really talk to the city and focus in on a path forward. So right now we're taking a look at everything and anything.
Okay.
And I would generally say you probably do have stops between the like your likely stop spacing is that you want to stop every place that an east-west route crosses a north-south.
Yeah, I mean, I just.
But you're absolutely right, and that's something that can be helpful for railroad crossings as well, that if you have a situation where you have a railroad crossing, to have that ability to detour around that by making sure you don't have any stops too close to that crossing, that can have huge benefits.
I mean, I know that let's face it, we all do it. The freeway's backed up, so you start cutting through. Do you really save any time? Maybe not. Andy, I mean, do our bus drivers have flexibility if they see? I mean, it's sort of probably a tricky, because you'll have the person who says, you caused me a longer delay because you went off the route.
Do operators stay on route? So as we devise a route and develop the route, we keep them on the route. Because if not, then, I mean, that's one thing. But one thing to Roberto's point, some of the tools that we're looking at to help a bus get to its destination in a more reliable fashion are things like signal preemption, where as you approach a light and you're running a little late, it holds the green. It's stuff like that that just allows the bus to more reliably get through a congested point. Or taking a right side queue in which a bus, actually everything on the right lane will go ahead of the rest of traffic. So there's a lot of different tools, but you got to make sure you do that in a very diligent fashion, or you affect the east-west traffic that the rest of the residents or our buses are. So it's very methodical, and you got to work your way through it. And that's what my team and Roberto, as well as Mr. Fontana, are looking at doing.
Sanjay?
I would say, agree with a lot of the discussion. signal preemption, those are part of the low-hanging fruit that you're talking about. You know, we talked about bus shelters, making the experience better, making it more ADA compliant. I think, given the economic reality that we are faced with today, I think it's beyond just the 14 cities, Houston and Harris County. It's also realistically considering, can we do some public-private partnerships when it comes to bus shelters? Is that doable? Is that something, maybe it fits under the planning for the future, but that's something we should be looking at, especially if we have a huge deficit of ADA compliant bus shelters, especially on routes that there's significant ridership. I want to pivot and go to, this is about 2017 budget priorities, right? And if you look at the numbers, the single biggest expense, over 50% of the expense, is on 4 line items. And all of that's got to do with new buses. Over 110 million of the 180, combination of obligated and non-obligated, is in new buses. It goes back to the statistics point that Christoph brought in, right? What's our fleet age? Statistically, do we need to do all of that in 2017? Is that something that can be spread out over the next 4 to 5 years? And I'll go, this is, again, don't know enough about it, but I would just ask us to look at, is it all going to be capital investment? Is a leasing option something that gets us out of this bind that we're faced with decreasing sales tax revenue? What is there a fleet age statistic that we can look at that allows us to look closer at when we pull the trigger on those buses? Maybe even go a step further, right? Is to say, how many buses do we have? We did a lot of optimization with the new bus network. Does that mean we've got more buses that are not in use on a daily basis? Does that allow us to defer some of this expenditure? And I think that would help, because that's, of the 128, or the way I read this, it's of the 186 state of good repair total for fiscal 17, over $110 million is 4 line items, is those new buses. So that's a big decision point, because we can try to squeeze as much out of 40% of the budget, or you can look at 60% of the budget, which is on just 4 line items.
Well, let me comment.
That's a priority issue.
We might pose a question to Andy, but I've looked at some of the statistics, and to use an old rancher's term, some of our buses are getting pretty long in the tooth, and are, I suspect are very near their maximum reliable service age. And you've got to always have a program to be updating the fleet and retiring buses that are too old to economically maintain. Andy, you might comment on that if you don't mind.
We had actually given a presentation at one of the recent committee meetings in which we detailed our bus replacement plan, the fundamentals of how we've come up with what we now have is a 1/12 the fleet plan for the majority of the buses. A transit bus life is 12 years as per the FTA, and our over-the-road or park and ride buses, based on their use, we're now at 15 to 16-year life with those vehicles. We did recently extend that life from 12 to the 16-year mark. We do have buses that are long in the tooth, as Jim indicated. They are 15 or 16-year-old buses. They will be, in some cases, 17 years old at the time of retirement. They're a very small percentage of our fleet. That was caused by a what we do now is a very routine, set level replacement rate, where it's 1/12 of the fleet. In years past, when Metro had purchased large quantities of buses, it might be great at the present second that you buy that large quantity of buses at one time, but that large quantity of buses gets old at the same time. It drives the general fleet age down. When you have a problem, you have a problem with a large portion of buses instead of a small portion of buses. So we've moved at a 100-year life. Part of the reason why we have some older equipment is because we're working our way through that large group of buses, slowly but surely working our way out as we buy 100. So we had 300 or so older buses that we're slowly working our way out of the system. So, I can re-give that presentation again if you like, but that's pretty much what it detailed out.
Are the buses that are long in the tooth safe?
Yeah, very much so. They met with the standards of the OEM from the time we've purchased them. They've received engines when they receive engines. That's all part of the state of good repair. You see it as an engine line, transmission line. Our mean distance between failure reliability is the best it's been in many, many years. consistently going up. Our fleet is very safe.
Okay.
The way I would put it from riding the system is, in general, I think we have one of the nicest fleets out there. If I compare us to other cities, our typical bus is a very nice bus in very good condition. However, when I see one of those old New Flyer buses coming down the street when I'm catching a bus, there's a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach for that part of the fleet where I'm like, they rattle, they just feel old. They are not nearly as comfortable a ride as the new buses. So it's a portion of our fleet, but it's a portion of our fleet that is notably worse in terms of not safety, not ability to get to where you're going. And I don't see it as a major reliability issue. Just in terms of level of comfort and the general appearance of the bus, there is that small portion of our fleet that nevertheless feels really bad.
Right. I feel confident we're already all over this, but with my new obsession with innovation and the rapidity with which it's occurring in all industries, including transit, I'm sure we investigate the most up-to-date technology, knowing we're headed toward autonomous buses at some point.
We utilize technology as it's entered into the market. There's some, we obviously with every new bus, we take in and utilize technology that's proven in the market and is reliable to our customer and is in use. So yes, you'll see things from seats to how seats have changed to how brake system these days are now all disc brakes instead of drum brakes. So as technology comes aboard, we actually integrate that with our new bus equipment.
And
Madam Chairman, just to make a suggestion, it might be a good thing to have Andy do that presentation that he did for committee on the contemplated replacement schedule for the full board. I was very comfortable with the parameters that they set forward.
Well, wonderful. I'd love to see it. And also, do our new buses have the technology that cars have where you get a warning if you're too close to someone or any of that, or is that even necessary in buses?
You'll typically see that type of technology trail behind that heavy-duty bus or equipment. Typically, that technology trails behind what you might see in a passenger car. That's more based on the size of the market and how much they can sell. But you're starting to see that more and more. We have like when you go in reverse on a new bus, actually a camera comes up and gives you a view from behind. And so there's newer technology on bus, but it typically in the heavy-duty market, that trails a little bit behind what you might see in your passenger cars.
Thank you.
But I do want to just echo, I want to make sure everyone on the board understands what I think Sanjay's point is. If you look at the detail with the CIP, and you look under the page 204, state of good repair, for the year 2017, just the first line and then the fourth line, I mean, we already will exceed the amount, if I understand this right, the amount of what I call discretionary funds, non-obligated. So if we want to do state of good repair, enhance the customer service and experience, all that, we're already in the hole.
You said it so much better than I did.
Well, I don't
Thank
know
you.
that I did, but.
Well, we have to do state of good repair. I mean, state of good repair is non-negotiable, isn't it?
I mean, I'm despite my comment here, I'm with Sanjay in the case that these are all expenses. We can look at which year they fall in. And in terms of, you know, if you want to give the example of my ride this weekend, yes, I was on one of those crappy old buses, but frankly, if you gave me a choice of fixing the experience of getting to the bus stop or getting a newer bus, I actually would have preferred a better experience going to the bus stop. What we have to make sure with the buses is that we do not hit the point which other systems have hit, where these buses get so old that they literally start falling apart and that your reliability really suffers. So far, Andy's crew has been doing a really great job keeping the fleet in such a condition that it can offer reliable service regardless of the age of the bus. At some point, we've all had this happen with an old car. At some point, it just gets so old that that's not possible anymore. And so in terms of state of good repair, we need to make sure we stay ahead of that.
And we might be at a point in time, I think Andy mentioned, right? There was a time where we did not have a planned annual replacement. We did spikes of purchases. This might be the result of that. We're faced with this choice today. because of that. And I also totaled the number of buses on those 4 line items, it's 200 buses. But that may be necessitated by a past decision, but we just need to make sure that moving forward that it's a smoother curve. And to Christoph's point, $110 million on new buses versus the cost to have a better bus shelter or an ADA accessible bus stop on major routes. What's the benefit? Can this be something that can be spaced over 3 years instead of all in 2017? I agree, state of good repair is not something that we don't want to get to a point where reliability, safety become an issue, but can we afford to? And based on the point that you made, Mayor, is if you look at the discretionary amount that's on there, it's about what we have for 2017. So something's got to give.
Well, and I think too, and and this is where we've got to rely upon staff to dig down into those numbers and Andy to give input in terms of, this may be what we want to do because we are trying to dig ourselves out of a hole, but we don't want to be in a situation, like I said, that in the year 2021 that we never get ahead of the game or even at the point you want to be because we keep kicking the can down the road. So, but we have to rely upon what staff is saying. Is there within that amount, this is what they want to do, but is there sort of some flexibility to spread it out, in the next year or the following year? Because the flip side of it is we've already made a big investment in the new bus network, and we'll have wasted that investment if we're not doing things like ADA, sidewalks, shelters, those things to further enhance the experience so that people will want to ride. If we don't invest now, then it'll be lost money that we spent last year.
Right. I wonder about the possibility, too, of partnering with nonprofits about getting our bus shelters and getting things in shape, because it really is hugely important.
If we rely solely on our funds to get the quality of bus shelters up to par, we will never get there. The partnerships are the only way to get there.
But I do want to make a point. We are the ones who are ultimately responsible for the compliance. When I'm talking about compliance, I'm talking about federal laws. We can't depend on not-for-profit organizations to share with us the responsibility of being compliant with the federal law, and I'm really concerned that we are out of compliance. I've asked for data about how many of those bus stops are in full compliance and how many are not. I haven't seen that yet, and that makes me be very concerned about the degree to which we are out of compliance, and that's not something we can push off on another agency. It's not something we can ask for donations for. It's something we are ultimately responsible for, and we will pay a larger price if we don't assume that and have a plan for dealing with it in the near future and make sure the dollars are there to do that. Now, we talk about relationship with other agencies. Christoph's example is a good one, but we can't just say in that case it's the hotel's responsibility to build out the sidewalk. We have to own that problem. We need to send a person, maybe a team of people, to go and negotiate with the hotel, to get the city to sit down to the extent they're responsible for a portion of that sidewalk. We have to own it, and to own it, then we have to go out and take the initiative to get those partners to do the piece that they have to do on the other end. If we're talking about people who own real estate or have businesses that are next to bus stops, we have to invest maybe a greater effort than we do now in getting those people to work together with us in the process of making our system, our community more walkable, more livable, and a better place to be.
And I think, one of the most basic examples to me is every time any construction project touches a sidewalk that includes a bus stop, that project should include bringing that bus stop up to ADA. That is not currently happening. And that may be a City of Houston project, that may be a Harris County project, it may be a multi-cities project, it may be a management district project, it may be a private developer. And in fact, a private developer is a large share of those projects. We need to be making sure that they meet ADA because, in fact, in that situation, as far as I understand, it is their legal responsibility if they were the ones who touched that. And if we simply did that and made sure that all of those were brought up to par, and better yet, not just brought up to minimum accessibility, but given a pad big enough for us to put a shelter on, given concrete big enough for it to reach the back door. That is one of the biggest impacts we can have, which will not show up on this bottom line, except to the degree that we hire the staff who is able to do all that legwork that Lex talked about, look at every single street project, look at every single building permit, and figure out how to improve the bus stop as part of that project. That staff time can pay huge dividends, but we need to do it, and it's not something this agency has historically done.
But I think it gets back to what Lex was saying, too, is having the data to understand what we've got out there. I mean, just logically, you have to know what you've got, where our holes in our, where our deficiencies are. And then it's cheaper if a city's putting in a street or a county's putting in a street or a developer's putting in a street. I mean, that's the time you can do it. And I mean, Sanjay, the engineers on here can speak to it better than I can, but I know that when we were doing sidewalks, doing a standalone sidewalk was like 3 to 5 times as much as if you just added it on to a street project.
It's a mindset change, right? We are, by virtue of this, wading into permitting responsibilities of other agencies. But the mindset change has to be, if there is a project going on that impacts a metro bus stop, there's automatically a set of things that need to be checked before it moves forward, whether or not the cost is entirely borne by the private landowner or the other agency, or it's a partnership between us and them. That's a next step. And while the compliance does need to rest entirely on us, with 8,000, 10,000 bus stops, we would need a lot more robust CIP to be able to have bus shelters everywhere, which then means an adoptive bus shelter type program is something that we almost, if we want a bus shelter that's accessible at every bus stop, I don't think it's an if, by law it's probably a when.
Well,
Or if it
or
already
to
should
make
be
the
there.
bus stops accessible themselves.
Yeah.
There's that aspect too.
We do need to go look at the adoptive bus shelter system-wide, and that's the only way we're going to get there.
I mean, we have to be I hate to use this word because sometimes people say that it's negative, but we have to be creative. And look for those partnerships, whatever it is, And this came up in one of the conversations months ago with one of the small cities. I mean, they were willing to put in the pad if we'd put in the bench. I mean, and even if they put in the pad and we're not ready to go with the bench or the shelter, at least we've got the pad in place that we can come in.
Sorry, go ahead.
And Karin, to your point on Adopt It, I think the Adopt a Shelter program, shelters are not legally required. ADA pads are. I don't think we should be thinking about an Adopt an ADA pad program, but thinking about an Adopt a Shelter program. Here's the legally required pad. The shelter is an upgrade that we all agree is a very worthwhile upgrade. That's the kind of thing where I think nonprofits can play a very useful role.
Well, and no one knows the ADA like Lex, but, we have to have the money to do it. So there's the competing balance of yes, and of course, yes, I think it's fair to assume we are out of compliance with a number of our bus shelters, and we need to address that post haste. The question is, how do we get it done with the money that we have? So it's a real problem. I mean, it needs to be a serious priority.
Lex, do you want to go ahead
I
with
just
your
want to be sure
priorities?
that we have a line in our budget that corresponds to that particular item. And obviously, it's not going to be done overnight, but if we don't have a plan and a specific plan, if we don't, in this layout here, we're generalizing, we've got these big buckets, and you could throw nearly anything into that bucket and define it the way you want it. So I think we have to have an understanding about the way in which we divide things inside those buckets. And as far as some of these items are concerned, I do think that we need to have metrics about how many of these items we're going to fix in what year, at what cost, and so forth. And I think the board can guide that, but unless we have the metrics, we're not able to do that.
And I think we can also project some of these things. If we know where our bus stops are, we know what the City of Houston's 5-year plan for reconstructing streets are. So we can say, these are the stops that fall on the street segments that we know are up for reconstruction, and those will get us this far in the metric. This is the funding we'll put in, this will get us, this is an estimate of how much development might get us, so that we can look at all these different pieces and see how they add together to get us to the ultimate goal, which is 100%.
Lex, don't you have to leave at 11:30? Who had to leave at 11:30? Troy, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I just wanted to say one more thing about just kind of piggybacking off of what Sanjay said. And I think that a lot of what we're talking about could easily be added to the scope of responsibility for our urban planner. I think
it's there.
Yeah, so good. So I think we're headed in the right direction. I think it just underscores the need to get this person on board soon. But piggybacking off what Sanjay said, when I think about shelters and pads, we're farther ahead on trees. When I think about, construction jobs, you can't touch a tree without a set of checklists and replacing the tree, protecting the tree. And it's just amazing that we're farther ahead on trees than we are on ADA compliance.
Let me
But we
tell you,
really
there's
are.
nothing that gets people more in an uproar than a sidewalk. I have fought that battle for 20 years, and you get I want a sidewalk, but I don't want it in my neighborhood. I want it, or in my side of the street, I want it in Carnes. How wide it is, how close it is to my tree. And I use the example when I was mayor, even in my own household, my husband and my youngest daughter were like, yeah, who wouldn't want a sidewalk? I'd like a sidewalk in front of my house. My oldest daughter goes, I don't want strangers walking down in front of my house. So you factor that in with the bus shelters, and you add that to it, you're right. Trees are much more protected
Well,
than.
then on sidewalks, you get the reaction from people, well, I don't want to pay an assessment for my part of it.
Yeah.
And I think just kind of going down that road with the urban planner, I think working with the city of Houston and making sure that the specifications, because I would like to think if any construction job's going on, if somebody's touching a pad or thinking about a shelter, we should know about it. And so the same way the city knows or the county knows what's going on, and there should be a set of specifications that are already predefined so that when you touch a certain area that has a pad or a shelter, you're going to meet these minimal requirements, and they would include these ADA considerations. So that way, not only do you have Metro following up on it, but you have City of Houston inspectors and the folks that are doing permits. You can't get the permit without meeting these
Yeah,
set
I agree
requirements.
with that. And really, you need constant liaison, particularly with the city of Houston. For example, we've had a situation where parking meters were put in dedicated bus lanes, which were paid for with FTA money. And, unless you're just constantly working with the various parties down there, the city is so huge and so diverse that they're just not going to really, our needs are not that high necessarily on a particular department's radar.
And that's, that's an obligation that we have that we need to, again, it's something we have to assume. Just to give you an example, there's a bus stop down on Polk near Chenevert, and one would use that bus stop to go to the GRB. The city's doing some construction there. They put up a new sidewalk, and they built a curb where a ramp used to be. You cannot cross Polk at Chenevert without running. I mean, the walk light is there, and next to the walk light where the ramp was, their construction team has built a curb. It's absurd, and that is, that's not on us, but it affects us. We own it because it's the people who are riding our buses who get off there and can't get what they're going.
It's just
So
crazy making,
Troy
really.
has to leave, so are there anything else that you want to add in terms of priorities?
I think we're headed down the right direction, and I think our 4 bullet points coupled with metrics, I think, those 4 bullet points coupled with metrics and then letting Tom and his team color that in, but we're watching and kind of guiding it. I think we're headed in the right direction. So I'm excited to see what comes out of it.
Okay.
I want to underline something that's come up in this, which I know that when our budget is tight, the instinct is to say we don't want to hire staff. I think some of these things we've identified, this discussion is pointing to the fact that the most cost-effective thing we can do in some cases is hire staff. That having somebody who's looking at those city permits and tracking city construction projects and watching this stuff will have a huge bang for the buck because it'll enable things to get done right without us spending money to fix them later. And so I want to make sure that in our budget, we have the staff on things like urban design, on things like passenger information to really track this. And I would also say that for marketing. I think that's another area where having enough staff to really do marketing well makes a huge difference. And we've seen it in when we staffed up our social media team, how much of a positive impact that's had on our riders. So I want to make sure we include in the budget the staff to do all of this right, not just the capital improvement line item dollars.
I would agree, and I think what goes along with it is sort of the flip side, which is making sure that we're not maintaining, which I know Tom calls it right-sizing the agency, we're not maintaining staff, which is an uncomfortable thing to talk about, in areas that we can work smarter, work more efficient, and don't need as many of the staff.
Right. I didn't
in a
just
particular
necessarily
area.
make an argument for increasing headcount. It may be shifting headcount to where it's needed, but we need those people.
Lisa, you've been over there using your calculator.
Just think like when we, it's probably in here, it's probably state of good repair, but any capital project will become an O&M cost. So it looks like the O&M cost are always like 74% of the budget. I mean, just kind of roughly looking at the pie. But, one day all those cars will have to be replaced. And so I don't think we can plan to replace them when I think that's what happens to other transit agencies, right? You get there and then boom, you don't have the money for it. So like you buy a car, your family relies on the car. You think about tires and oil and gas, and then one day your car needs to be replaced, but did you save for it? So I just think one thing that should be considered in the capital projects is some of them also bring on an O&M cost that's permanent and should be included in the budget.
So that's something I think, Art, that when you guys present the budget, that we need to have a clearer understanding of what that impact is.
Yep.
And that we are in fact addressing it. So any other priorities, anything different? Lex, do you have anything?
Well, one thing, again, it's not, I don't have enough data here. And part of the reason, it may be on this page, but my eyes aren't good enough to read that fine print very quickly. And I am thinking about the buses and the customer experience. And I don't know if we have a plan for replacing or updating upholstery inside some of these older buses. I think sometimes we really should be concerned about whether the motor's turning and all the gears are working. But sometimes I think you can improve relatively inexpensively the customer experience simply by updating some of the upholstery. I think Wi-Fi is something we've talked about. I haven't seen any metrics. I have no idea, relatively speaking, how much that cost, but it didn't cost me much to put Wi-Fi in my home or my office. So the technology may be much more expensive on a bus, but it's something that could improve the customer experience. I think those things, if we can find things like that that are not exorbitant in price and fit into that bucket, those would be useful.
So I guess in sort of wrapping it all up, I mean, I think what I heard this morning is that there's pretty much general board consensus on state of good repair, improving customer service and customer experience, of course, planning for the future, and what that means, like customer service experience. Bus shelters, ADA compatible, technology, marketing. I guess, I would assume, Tom, that you guys have enough information to try to go back and put the budget together, in that as you work through the budget process, if there's any questions or further guidance, and as we talk about matrix, maybe before the budget workshop, is run it through the appropriate, kind of vet it if you need more detail in the appropriate committee.
I'll make a couple of comments, and I'll let Art and Phil join in if they want. I think we can do this, and I understand the importance of making sure that we have metrics that we're managing our performance going forward. We clearly understand that and the need to do that. There's a lot of foundation things we're working on right now to show the gap analysis of where we have stops and shelters and compared to what we're doing, what the city's doing, multi-cities, county, management districts. So we're getting some good foundation pieces together to help us do that. The third area we're working on, and I want to thank the board committees, is even the new design standards. We heard a lot of talking about making sure we have concrete at the front door and the pad all the way to the back door. We've just briefed the Capital Strategic Planning Committee of what we think those design standards need to be, the implications of that, and we'll be working with our partners at the city and other areas to begin to embody that in their standards. So when you go forward, there's no confusion of what the expectations are and how we work our way through that. So I think from the sense of the staff getting the feedback from the board this morning, it's very clear we need to make sure that we've got good measures and how we're going to go forward to get the board's concurrence, and that way we can report on how we're doing to those measures. Making sure that we work on those low-hanging fruit, and I heard that a lot. We think there are some opportunities to do that. We will shape those opportunities and work it back through the relevant board committees back to the chair, and then make sure we got a good plan going forward. What we believe this is leading to is another direction from the chair as part of the retreat is, what's our 5-year strategic plan? I think what we're working on now is our first-year business plan. And as we come through the first-year business plan, we do some foundation things we're going to accomplish this coming year with the board support and approval, and then we look at year 2, 3, 4, and 5, because I think that's what we're beginning to lay out here. And so, Madam Chair, we're ready to move forward. Art, do you and Phil want to say anything? You're all good with that?
No, I'm good with that. I think the bottom line as to what finance is asked to do is create the envelopes. And so that's exactly what we do and what we've done so far, and we'll continue to update that. Once the envelopes are created, then these things that we've talked about today, which is metrics as to how you decide which discretionary projects roll into the obligated projects, that's something doesn't necessarily change the envelope, but it changes how you move things inside that envelope. And so I think we're a long ways toward getting the process finished. And I want to thank all the board members who came today and gave their input. I think we're moving in the right direction.
I have one specific question on an item here. Under system accessibility projects, it says public facilities reimagining.
What page is that?
Page number 1 of 4. And it's that second category of projects. It says public facilities reimagining. What is that project?
That's where we have the new signage initiative that we're
Okay,
working on.
excellent.
So, and I know, Madam Chair, you want to wrap it up. What I sort of heard today is we've given you guidance for 2017, but what the board is asking for, which I think falls back on planning for the future, is this upcoming year will be, because you're not going to come up with all the matrix by the time we look at the budget, that this will be a year of sort of getting those matrix and the data in place so that we're able to move ahead with 2018 and be able to drill down further and have more complete, have a better idea of how we want to move the money within the envelopes.
Right. And I do think we're really at the point where we must devote attention to ADA compliance. So I agree with Lex that we need some kind of line item or some, within the envelope, we have to designate money to get moving on that process.
Anything else? Any questions? Okay, I appreciate it. We're adjourned.
Thank you.